welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Ask a Production Expert. I'm Meredith Piemme. I'm a business development director with Production Solutions. And some of you might be wondering, like, what exactly makes me a production expert? So I'll give you a super quick background on me. After a failed attempt at veterinary medicine in college, I realized at the biochemistry class that it was not meant for me. I ended up falling back into graphic design, and with that, I landed myself in the nonprofit sector. So I was doing graphic design, led to direct mail production. I did that from '97 until about 2004, and then I had an opportunity to purchase a small commercial offset printing business, which I did, and then ran that until 2018 when I joined PS, and I merged my love of both of those industries together. So I have, I think, a little bit of a unique background in having been on both the fundraising, direct mail side, as well as on the actual production side. So with that, we are going to get started into what is going on today. I'm hopeful to burn through just a handful of slides in maybe 15 minutes. We're going to go through where we are, why we're here, and then more importantly, what we can do about it from a tactical as well as kind of a hearts and minds touchy-feely side of things. And I would encourage you guys, if you brought some questions with you, go ahead and throw those into the Q&A. Don't be shy. If anything comes up while we're going through things, again, throw those into the Q&A and we'll address those as best we can, either as we go through the deck or at the end. So I'm hopeful to leave 10, 15 minutes at the end to answer questions and make this more of an interactive piece instead of me just talking at you for way too long. Again, being mindful of everyone's time. I hope that you do have lunch, something to eat. And with that, let's go ahead and get started with where we are, right? So we're here in this awful, awful red space. This is basic Econ 101, right? So in that surplus, in that upper right hand yellow, we get a lot of stuff for real cheap, and in the shortage, we get just a little bit for a whole lot more money. And that is precisely where we're sitting in this direct mail industry right now, right? Budgets are exploding along with our heads, but this is our reality. And it looks like at a minimum, we're gonna be stuck in this for 12 months, possibly even 18. And it's a fundamental shift in the industry, right? I've been in this for 25 years. I'm sure some of you have been in this for longer than that. And we have always been able to chase that lower cost per thousand, right? Lower mail shop prices. I remember when commingling entered the scene and we could actually lower postage rates. That was nuts. But particularly post the 2008, 9, 10, 11 recession, we were in that inverse, right? Where we had massive supply and demand just dried up. And that drove the market way down, where printers and mail shops were just giving away work, right? So that they could make any kind of money to keep the lights on, pay rent, try and keep their folks employed. So we've been spoiled for a long time. And we're experiencing real shock with sort of this new way of how we're working. And that comes with a lot of challenges. So not only in this pricing side of things, but also with delays and shortages and some other disruptions that we're seeing. So I'd love to ask at this point, real quick, we're gonna run a poll and see how many of you have had a mailing impacted by this market. So we'll open this up for maybe 30 seconds or so. Go ahead and throw your vote in and we'll see. Almost there. All right, close enough. Go ahead and close that out for me, Catherine. So not everybody voted, but those of you that did, right, we're in it together, right? Sorry. We're all in this together, right? So I know it's kind of discouraging to see that everybody has had a mailing affected. We don't have any unicorns though. And again, we're gonna get through this together. And with that, can we move forward one? Thank you. So we've got to where we are. How did we get here, right? In our industry, everything is interconnected: inflation, labor, paper, logistics, postage. And not only does it all sort of build on top of one another, but it all connects and works with each other as well to create the cost increases and the disruptions and things that we're seeing now. So inflation, right? There's inflation on labor and raw materials. It's also impacted our postage rates. We're seeing the rise at the gas pumps, right? So that affects logistics. It also affects energy prices in manufacturing paper, in actually printing and mail shops. So it just compounds one another. On the labor side of things, I'm going to hop up on my soapbox for a second if you guys would indulge me. And as I had said in that previous slide, that we've been very used to chasing that lowest price. And that has contributed to suppressing wage growth, the growing wage gap, and wealth inequity in the United States. So we as an industry, not just nonprofits, right, but commercial mailers, the direct mail industry as a whole, we're part of that problem. And when the pandemic hit, that really created an opportunity for folks in that manufacturing sector to kind of take like a paid sabbatical, right? They were able to step away, re-examine life, priorities, work, and a whole lot of them said, I'm not going back to it, right? I don't want to do that anymore. And we're still seeing that now. So the most recent jobs report that came out in February, we're still seeing the loss of workers in the printing industry, right? So the growth that's happening in the jobs market is not happening in our sector. So our suppliers are struggling to retain talent, they're struggling to attract new talent. And that's leading to things like suppliers not accepting new clients until 2023, or leaving the nonprofit sector side of business in pursuit of higher profit margins, right? So like commercial mailers. We did see flat wage growth in February though. So that coupled with inflationary pressures and the lack of affordable healthcare outside of that employer relationship, that may start to drive some folks back into our industry, into that manufacturing side, but it is absolutely going to be at a higher cost. So we're going to continue to see these high costs stay in place on the labor side, right, with print and mail shop. But hopefully we will start to see it slow down a little bit. With paper, right, paper mills that took hits on inventory, selling unprofitable lines, selling at cost, that's over, right? Those days are gone. We're now bidding to get stock. We're all waiting on mill runs, right? There's absolutely no inventory. So we're putting in work orders, waiting for paper to be run in June, July, August, September, October. We're all competing, not just with each other, but again, with commercial mailers, with book publishers, with catalog printers. We're all competing for this kind of scarce resource that is paper. And mills are also continuing to pivot to producing stocks that bring in higher profit margins as well. So instead of producing, say, a number 3 or number 4 coated sheet like we use for our calendar production, they're looking at premium number 1 sheets, or instead of the white offset or white wove market, right, 50 pound, 60 pound white offset, 24, 20 pound white wove that we use in everything we do, they're moving to those opaque lines, again, at higher profit margins. And then postage, right? We saw a massive rate hike last year, another one happening this July, and then 2 times a year thereafter. So that's going to also continue to impact our budgets. We did see some good news with that postal reform bill that should be signed into law here pretty soon that removed that pre-funding retirement obligation. That's going to help, but we just don't know to what degree yet. So with that, I do want to spend just a little bit of extra time on the paper side of things. Because I think that this is probably the single biggest disruptor that we're seeing right now in our industry. This graph just shows the continued decline of graphic arts paper manufacturing in the United States, right? So you'll see at the peak there, we were producing about 31 million metric tons of graphic arts paper, and that's opaques, offsets, paperboard, craft, it's all of it. And then from there, it's just been this steady decline with a bigger dip during the recession. And then into 2020, we are now at 8.5 million metric tons of domestically produced paper. So that's a 73% erosion in that time frame. And we're back down now to what we were manufacturing in the 1960s. And where we were able to make up some of this, right, with imports, those are now snarled in that supply chain issue that a lot of folks have been talking about. I'm not going to get into the weeds on that today, including from imports from Canada as well, right? So we had that trucker disruption a few weeks ago. There was a railway work stoppage that fortunately was lifted yesterday, but it's not solved just yet. So our imports are definitely unstable as well. And then layer in the Ukraine conflict, right? So Russia is a major lumber supplier, and though we don't directly import from Russia, Europe does, and we import from Europe. They may stop their exports to keep their production domestic, right, to make up for the loss of imports that they bring in from Russia. So that's going to further disrupt our lumber, wood, pulp, and then ultimately paper industry in North America, particularly the United States. So the broader point here is that I want you guys to think of paper as like it's a pie, right? It's this limited resource, this 8.5 million metric tons of paper that we have. And each time we remove a wedge from that pie, the demand that's still in the middle, everybody still wants a piece of that pie. The pie is just smaller. So they have to trickle out and find alternatives to what was removed. So for instance, right now we have that strike with UPM in Finland. So we've lost 52% of the global supply of coated mechanical stock, which is the backers we use for labels. So all of the folks that were mailing labels, right, a lot of you are probably affected by this, they now are having to trickle out and find alternatives to that label stock. So whether that is another form, or they're looking for a notepad or greeting cards, or let's talk about the calendars, right? We talked about the mills wanting to get away from those less profitable product lines. So the number 3, number 4 coated sheets. That piece of the pie comes out, and now we start looking at, well, can we get a number 2 coated sheet? Can we move to an offset? Can we move to an opaque? And it's just that same demand, right, trickling out and gobbling up more of what is becoming a pretty scarce resource. So ultimately, what's happening is we're forcing some smaller mailers out, right? Whether it's catalogs, whether it might be magazine or book publishers, or whether, worst case for us, right, it's in the nonprofit sector, where smaller nonprofits or folks that didn't have solid relationships are unable to mail. And of course, that harms all of us, right? Because it removes those donors out of that common pool that we pull from to help grow up programs. So that's all the really terribleness right now. Let's talk a little bit about what can we actually do about it. And we'll start from a tactical perspective, and then we'll do some of the, like I said, touchy-feely hearts and minds next. We're an industry that is incredibly data-driven, right? We test, we back test, we retest, we control for all kinds of variables. And I think now a lot of us are feeling very much out of control. And that can lead to this victim mentality, right? Why is this happening to me? I'm not in control of this anymore. And that victim mentality can be fertile ground for all kinds of terrible things, right? Blame and anger, bad judgment, poor decision-making, leading from fear. So I'd like to encourage all of us to take a step back and think of the victim as our programs and not us. And we are like the medical team, right? So we're here to triage and fix this, where we can have teams that are in that day-to-day, and it really is day-to-day crises and changes, triaging our patients, our programs, and some of us can step back and be that differential diagnostician, right? Or a therapy person that's figuring out how we're going to fix the programs. And when we emerge, they may look very different from what they are today. Because as I said, this is a fundamental shift. And we talked about like the 12, 18 months. But what if it's 2 or 5 or 10 years? What if this is more of a permanent shift? So we need to get out of the reactionary day-to-day and start planning for kind of a future scenario of what this might look like. And every program is different. So we would encourage you guys, get with your agency partners, get with your internal teams, your creative folks, your strategy, your copywriters, your production partners. Please don't exclude them, whether you're working with one of the many stellar production firms in our industry, direct to supplier relationships. There is so much data that can be provided on that side to help inform that future planning. So really lean into those relationships. And that transactional work, right, that chasing that lowest cost per thousand and sacrificing the relationships, that served us well in the past, but that's really where it is right now. It's in the past, and we need to be focused on these relationships, focused on the future. So what are some actual tangible actions that we can take? What can we control, right? So we talked about labor, that our supplier partners are having difficulty attracting and retaining labor. So that means that they're going to be looking at what can they do to keep production high with less people involved? And that means for us, a movement to more machinable pieces, right? So we may end up seeing some of these high labor pieces, think maybe coin affixing or handwriting or Post-it notes. And those are just some examples. I'm not saying they're going to go away, but they could become very expensive, personalized notepads, or they just could become very difficult to get. And that means for us, now more than ever, it's going to be about messaging and data. If we're having to pivot into kind of number 10 packages, more standard formats, 6x9s and things like that, and remove some of these upfront premiums or some of these more, sort of tricks of the trade, if you will, that help us differentiate our packages. So is that going to look like modeling, right? Trying to figure out how to mail less volume with this larger budget, culling your non-responsive deep lapse donors and even maybe your low dollar folks into more inexpensive packages like your acquisition. Leveraging and collecting zero-party data to create that targeted donor experience that we're always talking about. Investing in your mid-level sustainer programs, looking at DAF, maybe even exploring corporate partnerships. It is absolutely critical to be providing mail plans and strategies 8 to 12 months in advance, which is not how we've historically worked, right? And we realize that if you're not already doing that, that's a heavy ask to be looking that far ahead. But to allow your production partners to support you and try their best to secure that stock, that press time to be able to get you in the mail, it's important that we're working that far ahead. Be prepared for your expenses to continue to grow. That's a hard one, right? Is now the time for what was once unthinkable, where we might be asking to revisit budgets mid-year. We reforecast for revenue, but we might be needing to talk to senior leadership about making additional investments into programs just to keep revenue flat, let alone grow it. We can test larger ask strings, right? With inflation and growing wages, when's the last time that that's been done within your program? Lower postage treatments, is it time to start looking at removing first-class postage if you haven't already for your outbound mail? Stamped reply envelopes, can we examine those? Can we segment for online donors and remove the RE entirely and drive them to those online donations? Could you maybe look at moving some front-end premiums to opt-in back-end premiums like your calendars? So instead of sending those to everyone, see who wants them and do that as a fulfillment piece. Program funding may decline while the economy rights itself with inflation, and we're also looking at that transfer of wealth from the previous generation to begin trickling down to the new generations. Invest really heavily in those evergreen controls. Now is not a great time to test. It's not only is it difficult to secure some of the components for testing, but trying to assess that pricing right now is almost impossible in this current market, and analyzing those test results without having accurate rollouts, how valid is that going to be? Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind too, is that as we're seeing delays in production and mail dates shifting and sliding, I think it's really important, if you haven't already, to keep an eye on your list rental exchanges co-ops. If you're starting to see that, make sure there's not overlap with house files and acquisitions and that you might have some cannibalization happening there. So that right now is it for the tactical side of things. Let's talk a teeny tiny bit about the touchy-feely part, right? What success is going to look like. So we need to commit definitely to this positive and personal mindset. And for that, we mean model those values that we need to succeed in this climate: collaboration, transparency, honesty, integrity, that positive, personal, authentic communications. And that might look like educating and actively discussing with your senior leadership, colleagues, and partners, right? The ongoing industry challenges, keeping them apprised of the changing environment and how things might be changing with your programs. Take that empathy and compassion a step further into problem solving together, right? So we said lean into those partnerships, do that internally and externally. Make sure you're not working in that kind of siloed approach with creating mail plans, trying to pivot and make changes, and then not include your partners in those discussions to see what is actually possible at that particular point in time. We say embrace the suck, right? We're all in this together. Again, that goes back to that victim mentality. We're not victims. We know this is terrible. We're all going to get through it together and work together. And don't lose sight of your long-term goals, guys. I continue to stand in awe of all of the amazing work that is done within this industry, all the different missions that are supported. And I don't want us to forget, as we're digging through, right, response rates and average gift and LTV and budgets and revenue and expenses, that every letter that we send out touches someone, right? And it serves a much larger purpose, much larger than ourselves. And so I try and re-examine that myself, that what I do makes a difference. And support your teams, right? So we're hearing a lot of concern within the industry about folks that might be looking to leave due to all of this uncertainty, the strain, the burnout, from hearing bad news day in and day out. And I would also say that we know that you're hearing the bad news. We would also just like to take a moment to remind you that someone on the other end of that line is having to deliver that bad news. And that's really difficult as well. So at PS, something that we've done is when we get that bad news, the first thing we say is, how can we help? And that goes to that partnership side, right? That collaborative problem-solving approach, as opposed to more of a blame or an anger. And we know that sometimes that's going to happen anyways, because we are all very, very frustrated. But if we go at it from that collaborative partnership approach, we can get a lot more accomplished together. And then my final thought on this one is just, I am so honored to be working in an industry that is absolutely packed with brilliant, creative people. And I am really eager to see what we are able to do, the kind of success we're able to make out of this. And I know that we're going to create that success in face of all of this uncertainty and this volatility, that we're going to be able to lead the way and show how we can pivot and strategize and turn this around. So with that, I have one more super quick poll for you guys, and then we're going to open up to a Q&A. So would anybody be interested in like a targeted micro session, like on paper or on labor or on inflation and how this all relates to our industry? I'll let that run for just a little bit, and then Catherine. That's one. All right, guys, don't be shy. Send me some questions. All right, some target. All right, so how about this? In that Q&A or in the chat, is there anything in particular from like a targeted microsession topic that you all would like to get into? Would it be paper? Would it be labor? Would it be formats? What would be appealing? And while you all answered that, paper allocation, yeah. And the fact we can't lock in price. Yeah, so the paper allocations, that's been something that's been really interesting. So for those of you who don't have a kind of a background or an understanding of that, allocation is a way for the mills to try and balance that supply and demand. So it's a way to prevent printers from trying to snag stock from like a just in case, I might need it. And it allows for more even distribution or fair distribution. But the way that it works is those mills tell paper merchants or printers, we're only going to allow you to buy the historic amount that you bought, say, the previous year. And the difficulty there is that really limits our ability to kind of price shop, right? Because we can't be certain that we're going to be able to secure that stock at a new supplier, since it was at a different supplier the previous year. And we actually had that happen just that with some coded sheets for a calendar production, where we had priced it before allocations were really kind of as tough as they are right now. And we were trying to lock in budget numbers. And so we did that back in May. And then the supplier that we had that calendar at, they were unable to get that paper when allocations were in full force about a month ago, 2 months ago. So we ended up having to kind of do a lot of pricing exercises to try and find a new home for that. Let's see, and then locking in price. That a lot of mills are doing prices prevailing at time of ship. And what that means is you could place your order with that mill, say in January, for a June, July mill run. between that January and June, when they finished running that paper, they could have had massive energy surcharges, labor shortages, pulp futures, pulp market could have gone up another 20 or 30%. So they can't lock in that price because there is so much in flux for them in terms of that actual manufacturing, that when they're all done producing it, putting it onto a rail, probably not a truck, at this point, that they have to build that prevailing price. And that is why it's so hard for us to lock in that cost. And these cost increases are coming in fast and hot. We've even seen 2 this month alone. The energy surcharges, there was a $3 per carton weight energy surcharge because the futures of coal jumped up 500%. So that was a massive impact. And that's what I mean by that interconnectedness, right? Where I think before, when things were a lot more flexible, there could be a little bit of a blip in one side of the market and we could absorb it as an industry whole, right? Where you didn't see these massive price increases. And now, like, this web is stretched so taut, everything is so tight, like my Spanx underneath of a formal dress is so tight that any kind of blip in there is just, those ripples are felt all the way through the entire industry. Let's see here. Jill, let me know if that answered you on that locking in price and paper allocation. Steve, really small nonprofit clients, that's a really good question. On one hand, their smaller mailing volumes actually are a little bit easier in some cases to obtain that stock, right? But in terms of the cost increases, it's obviously a lot more difficult for them to try and absorb that into their budgets when their revenue numbers are not as large as really, really large mailers. So I think, again, those are internal questions that they should be having of, is there a reasonable pivot to, say, digital? Can they diversify into other fundraising channels? Again, exploring corporate partnerships. Are we going to see kind of, I don't want to call it crazy, but we're going to see some things that we don't normally see, of maybe like mergers of smaller nonprofits with larger nonprofits? Are we going to see larger nonprofits try and leverage some of their components and buying power across smaller nonprofits? Are we going to see chapter-based organizations go to national models where the national folks are mailing for everybody because the smaller ones just can't obtain the same level of resources to stay in that fundraising space? Okay. And I would also say with that, yeah, so it could be that we start seeing, and ganging is another part that we're seeing is becoming difficult because it's not as profitable for printers to have to break down presses and swap out plates and gang run things and ship it to different spots and hold inventory and not hold inventory. So they're really looking for very direct routes of running a job, shipping that job, billing that job, and making it a little bit less complicated. Also less room for error too on their part as well, again, with that lack of labor force. So it could be that we see some of these smaller nonprofit clients as well, possibly trying to create like internal co-ops where they're working together to try and get mailings out the door. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so I've got Steve and Jill. Anything else on paper, guys, that you'd like to hear about? Are we good? Oh, and we're actually at time. Okay. All right, fantastic. I think that's it for me today. If there is anything that you were unwilling to ask in the public forum, please feel free to email, you can text, call. We're always available. We love to talk about all of this stuff. We will take a look then and see if there's like kind of a targeted micro session that might be more beneficial to get into some of the crazier parts of the paper industry, or into labor, or into what the future might look like for us. But hang in there. again, if we work together and we lean in hard on one another, I think we can do some pretty amazing things here. And I'm excited to see what this industry comes up with over the next few months. So take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us.